The chamber of the Intergalactic Council pulsed with artificial starlight, an imposing amphitheater where the fate of countless civilizations had been decided over millennia. Ambassador Jonathan Pierce stood at the center, his sharp blue eyes scanning the array of alien delegates who loomed above him in tiers of floating platforms. Some species, towering and insectoid, clicked mandibles in hushed conversation. Others, their translucent forms shifting with inner bioluminescence, pulsed in unreadable rhythms. The Xel'Thar delegation sat stiffly, their black carapaces reflecting the sterile light, their warlike posture barely restrained by diplomatic decorum. A low chime signaled the session's beginning. Grand Arbiter Threx, an elder of the reptilian Vascari, leaned forward, his scaled hands clasped. Ambassador Pierce, the Council has convened today to discuss a matter of grave concern. Your species has been engaged in open war with the Xel'Thar Dominion for 3 standard cycles. Despite overwhelming opposition, despite the destruction of multiple human colonies, we have received no formal surrender, no request for terms, no ceasefire negotiations initiated by your command. Pierce arched a brow but remained silent, letting Threx continue. The Arbiter's voice, usually measured, now carried an edge of disbelief. This is unprecedented. Every sentient species within Council jurisdiction adheres to standard surrender protocols in the face of overwhelming defeat. It is a fundamental principle of warfare, one that prevents unnecessary suffering, one that civilization itself depends upon. And yet, humanity appears to lack even the concept of yielding. We demand an explanation. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Some voices carried curiosity, others a distinct note of unease. Pierce took his time before responding, adjusting the cuffs of his diplomatic uniform. I appreciate your concern, Arbiter, but I must correct a fundamental misunderstanding. His tone was even, but there was something in his posture, relaxed, confident, that made the Xel'Thar delegation stiffen. Humanity does not lack the ability to surrender. We simply do not have the habit of it. Silence. Then, incredulous laughter from one of the avian Marash envoys, a series of sharp, stuttering chirps. The Vascari Arbiter did not share in the amusement. You do not have the habit of surrender? Pierce exhaled, tilting his head slightly. Ambassador Vec, he addressed one of the Xel'Thar representatives, I believe your people assumed the war would end quickly. Did they not? The Xel'Thar's multifaceted eyes narrowed. It should have. Our fleets outnumber yours 3 to 1. Our weapons surpass your technology in nearly every metric. By all logic, your forces should have capitulated months ago. And yet, we haven't, Pierce said simply. Let me tell you why. He clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slightly. The species represented in this chamber have, for the most part, developed surrender protocols because they see war as a political tool, an equation of resources and outcomes. A war reaches a point where loss becomes unacceptable, and thus, surrender is a logical alternative. His gaze swept across the room. That is not how humans think. We do not surrender because, historically, surrender has never guaranteed survival. It has never ensured peace. He took a measured breath. Our species evolved on a planet where survival was never guaranteed. We fought predators that saw us as food. We fought the elements that tried to freeze or burn us out of existence. And when we created civilizations, we fought each other. Every war in our history has been a struggle against annihilation, if not of our bodies, then of our way of life. Surrender has never been a certainty of safety. It has only ever been an invitation for subjugation. The council was utterly silent now. Even the ambient hum of the chamber seemed to dull. Pierce turned his gaze back to the Xel'Thar delegation. Your war doctrine is built on the assumption that an enemy will break, that fear will drive them to their knees, that once enough ground is lost, once enough ships burn, they will fold and beg for terms. He let the words settle. You made a mistake when you assumed humanity would behave the same. The Xel'Thar ambassador hissed lowly, mandibles twitching. You cannot be serious. You would rather see your people annihilated than surrender. Pierce's expression didn't change. "We'd rather ensure that if you kill one of us, we take 10 of yours with us. And if you push us to the brink, we'll burn the bridge behind us before we let you cross." The Vascari arbiter shifted uncomfortably. "Surely, Ambassador, this is rhetoric. Bluff and bravado. Humanity would not choose extinction over the mere act of submitting." Pierce's smile was cold. "Look at the battle reports. Read the accounts of your own soldiers. Ask them if my kind seems to be bluffing." The chamber dimmed slightly as holoscreens flickered into existence. Tactical reports, intercepted communications, and footage from the front lines. Scenes of human forces, cut off and surrounded, fighting to the last. Entire ships rigged to self-destruct rather than be captured. Infantry units, outnumbered 20-1, charging entrenched enemy positions with nothing but bayonets and defiance. The most recent engagement flashed onto the displays. The Battle of Vega 7, where a single human warship, crippled and out of ammunition, had rammed itself into the heart of a Xel'Thar carrier, detonating both vessels in a blinding explosion. The surviving Xel'Thar forces had fled, unwilling to face an enemy so willing to embrace destruction over surrender. A shift had come over the chamber. The amusement, the disbelief, it was gone. In its place was something heavier. Pierce watched them absorb the truth. "You wanted an explanation. Now you have it." He let the weight of his words settle. "We do not lack a surrender protocol because we are reckless or arrogant. We lack one because, to us, surrender has never meant survival." His voice was steady, unwavering. "We fight because we do not believe in losing. We fight because the moment we allow ourselves to kneel is the moment we cease to be who we are." A pause. Then Threx, the Vascari arbiter, exhaled slowly. "This complicates things." Pierce allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "I imagine it does." The chamber remained silent, but the shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. A ripple of unease moved through the assembly, an unspoken realization settling into the minds of the galaxy's most powerful leaders. The Xel'Thar had assumed they were fighting an enemy that would, eventually, break. They had been wrong. And now, the Intergalactic Council had to reckon with what that truly meant. The Council had not accepted humanity's defiance as an immutable truth. They were an ancient body, one that had tamed the warlike impulses of 100 species before humanity ever touched the stars. They had seen civilizations collapse and rebuild under their careful governance, shaping the tides of war and peace with the precision of cosmic architects. To them, human stubbornness was not a force of nature. It was a malfunction, a flaw to be corrected. New mandates were issued within days of the hearing. A formal resolution declared that all member species, including those under special wartime considerations, must integrate the Galactic Council's Standardized Conflict Resolution Act, which dictated the proper conditions under which a species must surrender in order to preserve life and limit collateral damage. The message was clear: humanity's defiance was unacceptable. The resolution was delivered directly to the United Terran Coalition's High Command, a document steeped in bureaucracy, stamped with the seals of a dozen species that had no comprehension of the world they sought to govern. It contained explicit language, terms of surrender, conditions for negotiation, emergency protocols for capitulation. The Council expected compliance, the way a parent expected a child to eventually see reason. The response arrived within hours. A single transmission, devoid of excessive wording or diplomatic embellishment. The United Terran Coalition does not recognize the legitimacy of this mandate. We will not comply. Surrender is not an option. No further explanation. No negotiation. The Council's halls, so often a place of carefully measured debate, erupted into chaos. Some species were outraged, calling for immediate sanctions. Others, particularly those who had observed human warfare firsthand, remained silent, troubled by what this truly meant. The Xel'Thar delegation, however, saw this as an opportunity. Ambassador Vec, emboldened by humanity's outright refusal, turned to the Council with something that almost resembled glee. "You see, they are not civilized. They refuse reason. If they will not accept surrender as an institution, then the only logical outcome is extermination. His words carried weight. The Council had tolerated wars before, had even sanctioned them when necessary. But a species that rejected the foundational rules of conflict, that was a species that threatened galactic order itself. The Xel'Thar pressed their advantage, urging the Council to recognize the war as one of necessity. Humanity, they claimed, was a force that could only be broken, not reasoned with. And so the Dominion moved. The Xel'Thar war machine surged forward with renewed aggression, pressing deep into human-controlled space. Fleet after fleet descended upon UTC worlds, expecting, demanding, a final, inevitable breaking point. They believed humanity's silence on surrender meant they had simply not yet reached the threshold where they would bow. They were wrong. The first indication came in the form of shattered supply lines. The Xel'Thar, so accustomed to their wars of attrition, found their forward operations crippled. Human forces targeted their logistics with ruthless precision, striking not at warships, but the lifeblood of their campaign: fuel depots, munitions factories, food supplies. The vast and overwhelming Xel'Thar fleets suddenly found themselves stranded, their engines cold, their soldiers starving. Then came the counteroffensives. Human forces did not engage in conventional warfare. They refused open battle when it did not favor them, retreating into asteroid fields and dead space, forcing the Xel'Thar to hunt them through terrain that turned every engagement into a brutal, grinding ambush. They did not abandon their worlds. Even when orbital bombardments reduced cities to molten slag, survivors emerged from underground shelters, striking back with weapons salvaged from fallen enemies. Even when surrounded, even when defeat seemed absolute, the human response was never surrender. It was escalation. The Battle of Orion's Abyss should have been the turning point in the Xel'Thar campaign. A human fleet, cut off from reinforcements, trapped against a gravity well, faced total annihilation. The Xel'Thar, believing at last that they had forced the breaking point, opened communications, offering terms. They broadcast their demands across all channels, expecting at least one human commander to see reason. Instead, they received an unexpected transmission, audio distorted by the interference of burning wreckage, but clear enough that the words sent a chill through even the hardened warriors of the Dominion. No surrender. The human fleet, crippled and outgunned, did not retreat. They did not yield. They overloaded their reactors, turning their own warships into weapons. They rammed into the Xel'Thar flagships, detonating in bursts of radioactive fire. They boarded enemy vessels, fighting in close-quarters combat long after their own ships had been reduced to drifting wrecks. Even unarmed personnel did not flee. Reports surfaced of human engineers, covered in soot and blood, detonating the very corridors they stood in just to take more Xel'Thar with them. When the battle was over, there were no prisoners. There were no captured warships, no negotiated settlements. There was only silence, the wreckage of a dozen fleets, and the slow, dawning realization that the Xel'Thar had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The Galactic Council, watching from a distance, began to understand. This was not just stubbornness. This was not just war. Humanity did not break. Humanity did not surrender. Asterisk, asterisk. And in that moment, the Council finally began to wonder, if the Xel'Thar could not force humanity to yield, then what was the true cost of trying? The aftermath of Orion's Abyss rippled through the galaxy like a tremor before an earthquake. What had once been murmurs of unease in the Council chambers became something heavier, something that settled into the bones of every species that had believed itself wise in the ways of war. There had always been an understanding, an unspoken agreement, that every civilization had a threshold, a point beyond which surrender was not just expected but inevitable. Humanity had shattered that assumption. The Xel'Thar Dominion, for all its might, was bleeding. What had begun as a campaign of calculated conquest had devolved into a war of attrition they had never prepared for. The Dominion was built on the principle that war was a means to an end, that power was seized by breaking an enemy's will before breaking their body. But humanity had no threshold, No final moment where they would raise their hands and offer fealty. They fought until there was nothing left of themselves or their enemy. And the Dominion was beginning to understand what that truly meant. Ambassador Vec, once so certain of his people's inevitable triumph, now stood before the council with a different posture. The arrogance that had once colored his speech had faded, replaced with something sharper. Desperation, perhaps, or realization. "We must escalate," he hissed, his mandibles clicking in agitation. "We have held back, believing that strategic domination would be enough. It is not. These creatures, these humans, do not respond to pressure as expected. They do not submit. They are a cancer on the galactic order, and the only solution is complete and total eradication." The chamber was silent, not in agreement, not in opposition, but in something worse, uncertainty. The Vascari arbiter, Threx, exhaled slowly, his scaled fingers tapping against the arm of his seat. "You propose genocide, then? If that is what it takes." A murmur spread through the delegates. Some recoiled at the word. Others exchanged wary glances. It was not that war crimes were unheard of in the histories of the species gathered here. But never had such measures been proposed in the open, on the floor of the council itself. And yet, as much as some recoiled from the thought, others entertained it. Because they, too, had seen the reports. They had watched as humanity refused surrender, had watched as they fought past the point of reason, past the point of survival itself. The prospect of an enemy that did not break was not just frightening. It was a problem without precedent, one that called into question the very structure of galactic diplomacy. Pierce, who had remained silent through Vec's declaration, finally shifted where he stood. He had seen the way the council deliberated, the way some of them entertained this path as if it were just another maneuver on a game board. And he knew what came next. His voice was calm when he spoke. "You would exterminate us?" Vec turned to him sharply, eyes glinting. "Your kind has left us no alternative." Pierce did not look at him. Instead, he let his gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of the other ambassadors, some uncertain, some grim, a few already resolved. "You believe that if you destroy enough of us, the rest will yield. That if you break enough worlds, burn enough cities, we will see reason." He shook his head. "But you still don't understand, do you?" Vec bristled. "Understand what?" Pierce stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. When he spoke again, his words carried no bravado, no theatrics, only certainty. "If you attempt to erase humanity, we will ensure you burn with us." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, it was the Xel'Thar who stiffened. Not in rage, in fear, because there was no doubt in Pierce's voice. No threat made in desperation. Just fact. "We do not surrender. We do not yield. And if you make extinction our only option, we will make sure it is not ours alone." He let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle on the chamber like a slow-building storm. "Our ships are armed. Our worlds are fortified. And if you press us to the point of no return, we will turn our weapons not just on you, but on the stars themselves. We will crack planets if we must. We will poison the systems you call home. We will ensure that for every human world you destroy, a dozen of yours fall with it." He took another step forward, his voice still measured, still cold. "Do not mistake this for bravado. We have studied your histories. We have learned the way you think. You expect a fight to end when one side sees reason." His lips curled slightly, a ghost of smile that held no warmth. "We do not fight like that. We never have." The silence was different now. It was not uncertain. It was not deliberative. It was horrified. Vec's mandibles twitched, his hands curling into fists. "You would commit mutually assured destruction? You would throw your entire species into oblivion?" Pierce held his gaze. "If the alternative is submission, yes." The Xel'Thar ambassador did not reply. Because he knew. They all knew that Pierce was telling the truth. The weight of it crashed down over the chamber. The realization that the war was not simply a conflict with an eventual conclusion. That the Xel'Thar had begun something they could no longer control. Because there was no victory in a war against an enemy that would rather set the galaxy ablaze than kneel. The Vascari Arbiter was the first to speak, his voice quieter than before. "Then what solution do you propose, Ambassador Pierce?" Pierce exhaled slowly, the first and only sign that he was not as unshaken as he appeared. He had been waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, he knew that the true battle had begun. Not one fought with ships and soldiers, but one waged in the space between desperate alternatives. His voice was steady. "Peace." Vec made a sharp sound of disbelief, but Pierce did not acknowledge him. He only looked at Threx. "We do not surrender. That will not change. But we are not unreasonable. If the Dominion withdraws, if they cease their campaign, then the war ends here. Now." Threx studied him, searching for deceit. Finding none, he turned to the Xel'Thar ambassador. "Ambassador Vec, do you accept this?" Vec's eyes burned with rage, but it was a hollow rage now, because he understood the reality of the choice before him. The Xel'Thar had started this war, believing it would be one of conquest. Now it had become something else. Pierce had forced them to face the truth. They cannot break humanity, and if they did not stop, humanity would ensure they shattered alongside them. The Xel'Thar ambassador's jaw tightened. His mandibles clicked once, and then at last he inclined his head. It was not surrender, but it was enough.